Let me just say to members opposite that, as I understand the terms of the motion that's been proposed by my friend from Ottawa Centre, it refers to the years 2001 to 2009. It is not confined to the period after the Conservatives took power or took office. So let me make it very clear on behalf of our party. We accept we support this motion, and we understand that the implications of that motion are that the conduct of the previous government is going to be equally subject to scrutiny as the conduct of the current government. And I think it's important for people to understand that. I mean, I know it's, when I say this is not simply a partisan issue, I know that there will be chuckles on the other side of the House. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, we in this party are supporting a motion that refers to a public inquiry that will look at the conduct of governments with respect to this question of the transfer of detainees. The minister and others have gotten on their feet over and over again to say that the agreement that was negotiated prior to 2006 and that was signed by General Hillier during the election campaign of 2005-2006 on behalf of the Government of Canada, that was a flawed agreement. And if you listen to the comments that were made by Mr. Colvin, you would certainly come to that conclusion. Because as a result of that agreement, we discovered, and over time it was found out, that the Red Cross, in fact, could not report instances of abuse to the Canadian authorities. They could only raise them with the Afghan authorities. The Red Cross has repeated again over the weekend its very strong view that it retains its credibility and its deep neutrality as an organization because it does not engage in political conversations. And they've insisted on that. We also found that there was no ability on the part of the Canadian authorities to investigate any issues that have taken place. Mr. Speaker, I guess my simple point would be is that the government can't really have it both ways. The government can't say that nothing happened untoward, absolutely convinced, 100% certified, guaranteed that nothing happened with respect to any detainee who was transferred to the Afghan authorities, and then say that the agreement was deeply inadequate and that they spent a year and a half in trying to fix it and make it better, and then reached the conclusion that a whole series of steps needed to be taken to ensure that, quote, problems, quote, were dealt with. Well, the question arises, what were the problems? What was it that made the Conservative government decide that, in fact, there needed to be a change in the agreement? What was it that they finally concluded led them to realize that they had to make substantial investments with respect to reviewing, inspecting, investigating, looking at the whole structure? What was it that made the government do that? The answer, my friends are shouting across the way, a flawed agreement. There's no doubt it was a flawed agreement. There's no question about that. Of course it was a flawed agreement. It was an imperfect agreement arrived at by people who were doing their best in the circumstances and who didn't fully realize its inadequacies. And I can say to the honourable member who continues to shake his head because I can hear him doing so, he makes it very clear to me. Makes it very, very clear, Mr. Speaker, that what he's saying is it was the government's fault. Now, let me make it clear, Mr. Speaker. We know how these policies get developed. They get developed by people on the ground. They get developed by lawyers who are reviewing material, and ultimately it gets approved or not by a cabinet. That's how it works. Now, a Liberal cabinet, yes, and it's the decision of that cabinet that will be reviewed by the inquiry. It will be reviewed by the inquiry, and a decision, and if it was a wrong decision, that's what it would be. And it's up, if this government were serious, if this government were prepared to listen for a second I don't think you're hearing what I'm telling you. The conduct of the Liberal government is every bit as much the subject of the inquiry as the conduct of the Conservative government. That's the reality of this war. The reality of the war is that it was a war that was entered into by a Liberal government on behalf of the people of Canada because of the nature of the attack at 9/11. And further steps were taken by this Parliament, by which we agreed that we would in fact continue and maintain our support for the troops. So let there be no question. We are supportive of our troops. We are supportive of the efforts that have been made. We're supportive of the determination. There's absolutely no allegation, none whatsoever, that any Canadian officer or Canadian soldier was ever involved in the mistreatment of Afghan detainees. That is not the question. The question that is before us is, did we take full note of the information, and I stress this word to the minister, the prosecutor from Manitoba who sits across from me, to the information, not evidence, information that was reported to the government by a range of sources, not just Mr. Colvin. This emphasis on it's all about Mr. Colvin versus the three generals. It's all about Mr. Colvin versus Mr. Mulrooney. With great respect, that's not the issue. The issue is, what was the information that the Government of Canada had? And what did they do with that information? And how did they process that information? And why did it take so long to go from hearing the information with respect to the conditions in Afghan prisons and the treatment of prisoners and the decisions that were ultimately made with respect to how those would be reviewed? Je pense que, Monsieur le Président, il faut dire deux.
I think that certain points have to be made. Firstly,